Welcome to the Black Seats. This is the second part of our trilogy of blacks in baseball, the history of African Americans in baseball. And the first one we talked about pre Negro Leagues, and we talked about the first African American baseball player, Moses Fleetwood Walker. Um, so check that video out if you haven't seen it. But in this one, this is we saw, and this is where we talk about the formation of the various Negro Leagues that existed between 1920 and the early 1950s. And we're going to talk about those developments. And I call it We Saw because this was the first time that you got to see black people playing organized baseball and showcasing their talents. So we're gonna start off. Many leagues were actually started off in the 1800s, late 1800s, and the early 1900s. Um, but most teams were independent and they played in like exhibitions rather than playing like a scheduled season and having like a World Series and stuff like that. And the fact that like they were independent and not organized, it led to a lot of pirating. And pirating actually happened in the early major leagues as well around the late 1800s and early 1900s, where teams would be able to pick players from other teams and offer them far more money than the original teams could offer them. And, you know, if you think there's a lot of like player movement now with free agencies and trades, like back then, people, weren't beholden to the count to the teams that they were playing for. And you got to remember these were times where people were playing baseball not so much as like a means of living, but something where they can make extra money. So obviously, if like another team was paying you a lot more than the team that you are currently with, like obviously you're gonna go where the money is. Like you gotta put food on the table. So Rube Foster is a very important person in the history of black baseball, and to bring to a point like the pirating, Rube Foster started one season on one team, played another team in what was called the colored championship, which was like the closest thing blacks had to like their version of the World Series in the 19 teens. I think this was actually 1914. So he played on one team 1 year, beat a team, and then that team that he beat pirated him from his original team. So in the rematch the following year, he was playing for the opposite team and beat his original team. So he was like a back-to-back champion on like two different teams. Rube Foster was essentially the mastermind of Negro League baseball as a player, a manager, an executive, and an owner. Um, um, what I'm about to get into concerning Rube Foster, you're gonna be like, wow, like he really did all of this, and yes, he did. It's crazy. And it's crazy. What's sad is that he may have been as influential in these different positions as a player because he is regarded by many who had seen him play as a great pitcher. And I think it's rumored that some major league teams used to bring him in to be- become like a unofficial pitching instructor because he was that good, and so his talent was like recognized by the white major leagues, but not enough to be employed by the major leagues. And it's sad because he may have been influential in all of those different positions if it were not for the color of his skin. Like, if he weren't black, like he would have probably been someone you talk about at that time, comparable to like Connie Mack, comparable to John McGraw. So it's crazy. I always say like racism is just stupid. Like, you just look at the color of a person's skin, and you already discount them, even though the result of their work shows that they are far more than qualified to be on the same level as the white players were, and the white managers, and the white executives, and the white owners. Uh, Rube thought of an all black league, organized black baseball league, but he wanted all of the owners to be black, which was which is understandable because black ownership. You wanted the people profiting off of the work of these black players to be black, because when you're excluded from a white league and you create your own black league, you want the beneficiaries to be black people, since the white leagues weren't allowing you that avenue. But the only white man he did trust to be an owner was J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the team that eventually became the Kansas City Monarchs. And J.L. Wilkinson is the person who actually initially signed Jackie Robinson to his first pro deal. So the Negro National League was founded between February 13th and February 14th of 1920, and Rube Foster was the league president, and he presided over rosters. So he decided which players will go on which teams, the equipment, which was purchased from Rube Foster, and he was responsible for the booking. And because he was responsible for the booking, he took 5% of the entire league's gate receipts. So he was very like business savvy. Like, he was basically Diddy. Like, he like the Negro Leagues was like Bad Boy Records or making of the band, and like he was the one sending people to get cheesecake from Junior's. The Chicago race riot of 1919. If you're not familiar with that, this is a time when a lot of black soldiers from World War One were returning home, and it's incredulous. I talk about it a lot on the podcast and the different things we talk about when we talk about the history of African Americans and respecting the troops, and what it means to be a patriot when you're black and you love your country, but your country doesn't love you back. So these were soldiers returning from war, and they would walk the streets in their uniform, and they were actually attacked and stripped of their uniform. Mind you, these are people that fought for their country and risked their lives for their country, and this was um the thanks they really got from racist white Americans. And one of the places that was done in was in Chicago in 1919. And if you're familiar, around that time, 1919, same time that the Tulsa that race riot, when that took place, when blacks were basically bombed and ran from their homes. Like, I think they called 1919 the Red Summer because there's a lot of attacks on black communities and a lot of lynchings. So for that reason, the National Guard had occupied one of the teams in Chicago's home park, and it forced him to cancel their games, their home games, for about a month. And if you think about like the pandemic and the MLB having a shorten their season, the NBA having a shorten their season, and some of the financial losses, and these are like the big leagues. We're talking about the Negro National League in 1919, like having to postpone a team schedule for a month is really detrimental to the revenue and popularity of the league. So, as a part of that initial meeting in 1920, along with the Negro National League, a governing body was formed, which was called the National Association of Colored Professional Baseball Clubs. And it governed the Negro National League and any other black major leagues that would be founded thereafter. Nat Strong was Foster's rival in the New York City area. He was a white man and he owned several of the parks that black baseball was played in, so he got a significant cut. Foster and the National Association of Colored Professional Baseball Clubs wanted to move into that territory. He steadily did so, starting off with a team in Atlantic City. But the first Negro World Series was held in 1924. And the sad thing about Rube Foster is that a gas leak in his home nearly asphyxiated him in 1926, and he became increasingly erratic, and it led to him being committed to an insane asylum in 1927. The Negro National League folded around the time of the Great Depression, and some teams joined the Negro Southern League, which was one of the leagues that joined the National Association of Professional Baseball Clubs. But a a new Negro National League was founded in 1932. And if you're familiar with Bonnie and Clyde, Scarface, the rise of the mafia in New York City, even though like the rest of the country was struggling economically, there was one business that was booming, and that was the business of crime. And that was no different in the black community. So at that end in Pittsburgh, Gus Greenlee was a gangster and a numbers runner, and he thought that he would be able to launder money from his criminal empire by owning the Pittsburgh Crawfords. But this was until he saw how much money Cumberland Posey was making with his Homestead Grays across town and became fully invested in baseball ownership, so much so that he used $100,000 of his own money to build his own stadium, because a lot of these teams, what they would do is they would rent the major league parks in a lot of these towns, or in towns that didn't have a major league team, like the best minor league park. And to that end, a lot of the white owners or proprietors of these parks would make significant amounts of money by hosting black baseball games. But the issue with that is that you not only paid rent, you had to give them a cut of like ticket sales. And if you're playing in like white owned ballpark, remember this is a time of like Jim Crow and racial segregations, you probably couldn't use the locker rooms as the white major league teams or white minor league teams. So you're talking about guys having to like dress in the bus, um, or come to the ballpark dressed. So Gus Greenlee was the first person. He built $100,000 ballpark, $100,000 in the 1930s, especially in a depressed economy, is probably like tens of millions of dollars today. So he built his own ballpark in order to not have to cut his money with anybody else, but also give the Crawfords their own stadium. So this was called Greenlee Field, all in Pittsburgh. And at one point, I'm not really gonna get to talk about them in this episode, but I will drop their names and suggest that if you're watching this, that if you're not familiar with them, that you look them up because they are two of the greatest baseball players of all time, Hall of Famers, but didn't get the chance to play in the major leagues. Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, arguably the greatest black hitter and black pitcher ever, were once both members of the Pittsburgh Crawford. At one point, they played together. Greenlee also innovated the Negro Leagues by replicating the All Star game of the major leagues. But unlike MLB at the time, the writers would choose the All Stars then. Greenlee, he introduced fan voting, and part of the reason for that actually isn't even just because it's like, oh, like, let's let fans decide who gets to go on the All Star game. The reason for that is because there weren't many national publications that were following Negro League baseball regularly. So it might have been done out of necessity because obviously, if there aren't enough writers, like, how would they be able to choose all stars? And unlike the major league, where during World War II, a lot of the players had to leave to join the armed forces and fight in Europe and in the Pacific, and the quality of the major league game was kind of watered down because it was a lot of guys who were too old for service, or they were who were young and weren't probably fit to serve, but also weren't like the most talented baseball players available playing in the major league. So the major league game was a lot different. You're talking about 1941, like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, up until 1945, 46. But the interesting thing is the Negro Leagues actually thrived during World War II because millions of Black Americans were working in the war industry. Because obviously, like a lot of the white men who had those factory jobs went to war, and a lot of the Black men were probably denied the ability to serve in the army. So, but they still needed people to make weapons and ration and different kind of war materials. So that really like boosted the economy in the black community. And since they were making good money, they packed Negro League games in virtually every city. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was MLB's first commissioner, and he was appointed to the position. And the only reason he agreed to the position, he was a former judge. He wanted to have the ultimate power in baseball. Like, once he ruled, no one could rule over him. And he also requested it to be a lifetime position. Both things played badly for blacks who wanted to be in the major leagues. He was appointed to the position after the 1919 World Series, after the Black Sox scandal. If you're not familiar with that, the Chicago White Sox, 8 men on the team were accused and allegedly threw the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. And it was really like a big old like black stain on the sport of baseball. So they needed somebody to come in and be like the almighty power and like the unshakable like arbitrator in baseball, and they chose Kennesaw Mountain Landis. But he opposed integration, which is why, with the events of last summer, where the nation and actually to an extent, like the whole world started to realize this like racial equality awakening, it was decided that his name, which was the namesake of the American National League awards, his name would be stripped off of it. And so now his name is no longer on the MVP awards in baseball, in Major League Baseball. And that's because not only was he opposed to integration, but he blocked numerous attempts to integrate, such as one major example, Bill Veeck, who's one of the most famous owners in the history of the game. He attempted to buy the Philadelphia Phillies, who at that time were like a really, really bad team, basically for the first part of the 20th century. They were like, perennial, like a perennial last place team. So they were up for sale. And he wanted to buy the team and basically restock the entire team with Negro League players. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis caught wind of this, and he decided to block Bill Veeck's attempt to buy the Phillies and then approve someone else's purchase of the team. Another thing is, like, when he was asked why he wouldn't allow blacks to play in the major leagues, he would say, well, they have their own league, talking about, these various Negro leagues, the Negro National League, the Negro American League. So, with this recent announcement that the Negro Leagues between 1920 and 1948 would be recognized as one of the former major leagues, and all of their numbers would count in the major league record books. You could use his own words as evidence that the Negro National League and the various Negro leagues were on par with the American League and National League, because he was basically saying, like, well, we won't allow them in our league. They have their own league. So that one would assume that means he's admitting that they were qualified to be major leaguers, just not in the white major leagues. And since his position was held until he died, people basically figured that upon his death, literally over his dead body, is when blacks would be able to break the color barrier. And it was correct, because his successor, Happy Chandler, who was the former senator from Kentucky, took over, and he supported integration, ironically, because of what I said, blacks' service in the military. He said he stated that he couldn't deny African Americans right to play baseball after the willingness and the effort of blacks in the war. And one black veteran was signed thereafter, Jackie Robinson, in 1947, and he integrated the National League. And a year later, Bill Veeck himself, once he owned the Cleveland Indians, signed Larry Doby, and he integrated the American League. And ironically, just showing what happens when blacks are finally given the opportunity to play with whites, both teams, Jackie Robinson's Dodgers in 1947 won the National League pennant, and Larry Doby's Cleveland Indians won the American League pennant in 1948, and they also won the World Series. And as far as Happy Chandler goes, unfortunately, the fact that he used his ultimate power as commissioner to allow for blacks to integrate without the approval of owners, he was actually forced out not too long after his time as commissioner. And so this has been part two. We saw. Stay tuned for part three. We conquered, where I'm just gonna detail the decade or so after integration and the effect that blacks had when they finally were able to enter the major leagues, as well as the decline of the Negro Leagues. So I'm Suge. Thanks for watching the Black Seats.